Hello, everyone. I'm Simeon Djankov. I'm a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, and I'll be the moderator of today's seminar on the price of America's economic nostalgia. We have an all-star cast. We will start with Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, who will present his research just earlier this week, published in Foreign Affairs. Robert Lawrence of Peterson and Harvard fame will then present some preliminary work from his forthcoming Peterson Institute book on the decline of manufacturing industries. And then Professor Penny Goldberg of Yale and also Peterson will talk about snowballization and trends in global trade. We have too much to do with too little time, so I pass immediately to Adam. Please, up to 15 minutes each presenter. We will look for questions and answers directly and then take questions from the audience. Adam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simeon, and thanks to Robert, Penny, you, and other colleagues who brought us together today. We are trying to challenge some perhaps misleading, well, certainly misleading and perhaps disruptive frameworks that are being used to talk about trade in the US right now, and we think we have the evidence to do that. So let me talk a bit about the price of American economic nostalgia. The simple statement is the US has not recklessly pursued openness at the expense of workers. In fact, US governments have been basically withdrawing from globalization for roughly 20 plus years, on immigration for longer, on trade for that long, on investment for a shorter amount of time. This isn't a story of neoliberal elites who hung American workers out to dry. And so we need to have protection right now because we've already been pursuing the protectionism and it's failed. There is this emphasis in President Biden and other administration officials' remarks, just as there was, albeit in a more toxic form under President Trump and his administration, that we have to have pursuit of good jobs in manufacturing. This, as I will argue, and Robert will put some broader perspective on, is not only an effort doomed to fail, but doing this pursuit of manufacturing jobs is going to neglect and in fact harm the 86% of lower income workers in the US who are in service industries. There's also, as much as we see the pain of these small towns, cities, rural areas where a major employer goes away, we do not have a reliable method to restore local economies, no matter how politically attractive and no matter how compassionately motivated this is. But what we can do is what we have not been doing for the last 20 years, for the last 30 years, which is provide more universal benefits for workers and families in the US and make job change a safer, easier, rather than trying and failing to protect specific workers who are primarily, frankly, white, male, when we favor these manufacturing and these rural jobs. In fact, what the US needs to do now is to open itself up again to external pressure. We spent decades telling everyone, if you are a closed economy, you breed corruption, you breed privilege, you breed inefficiency, and that is now the US. And so we need not only more international competition, but to join places where there's higher standards than what we ourselves have on environment, on labor, and we need to raise ourselves up through that opening. In the end, this is a political argument as much or more than an economic one. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is we've given the angry white males much of what they wanted on the international front. We've put up protection, we've withdrawn from trade and finance. You cannot buy off the nativists and the populists by reinforcing their nostalgic sense of status, or by tying them tighter to their local communities. We have to move on. So What I'm also presenting today is some work done by a whole team here at the Peterson Institute, led by Simeon Djankov, a bunch of analysts here who are doing great work. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Madi Sarsanbayev and Eva Yuwenshang, who've done great work fleshing out the fact that the US has been disengaging from the global economy. We have a new online PIE tracker. My presentation today is essentially the launch of that. And we're going to be expanding it and updating it regularly just to make sure everyone is aware of how the US has been withdrawing. In particular, just start with the image of trade. The world has been growing more and more open to trade. The share of trade, goods and services trade as a percent of global GDP has gone up. The US, of course, has a lower percentage of openness than most economies because we're large, we're continental, we're diverse. But we have flattened out and in fact retreated. And this is the bottom part of the chart, the difference between world and US trade as a percent of respective GDPs. And this will be brought out more cleanly in Penny's work, looking at her personal assessment of how trade has evolved in recent years. Even though we're in a period of globalization, the world has recovered its trade since the 2008 crisis, but the US has continued to close down. And if we look at our comparator economies, the other high-income democracies, the G7 plus or minus, what you see is that even Japan has gone up since Abenomics in 2012 in terms of its engagement with the world, while the US has gone backward. So when we have this global trend towards more globalization and more trade integration, and the US is falling further backward, and it's not just Eastern Europe and China catching up, it is the other industrial democracies moving to open and the US moving to close. Foreign direct investment has similarly told a story of we're not being taken over by foreign owners. US foreign direct investment flows, of course, fluctuate year to year based on big deals and small deals, but essentially as a percent of GDP, if you look at the top chart, it stayed in a very low range. All the tax cutting, all and everything has done nothing to secularly raise foreign direct investment in the US. In addition, Greenfield expenditures, which means not just taking over companies, but actually building new plants or new R&D or new employment in the US, has been declining in absolute terms and as a share of GDP. Now, the omission of data, the dotted lines there, which we found, is a reflection of the lack of data in the US government. So it's conceivable we missed some huge uptrend. But now we're looking at a downtrend that's been ongoing for going on 7 years. And this reflects not anything other than the general climate of hostility and suspicion towards foreign investment in the US. The immigration story, which is supposedly one that has fueled much of the populist race, is also one of retreat. After the horribly exclusionary period of the 60s, we have seen average growth in US immigrant population be quite high through the 70s and 90s, and then steadily going down. Obviously, President Trump's administration and hostility drove it down even further in the past 5 years, but even under Obama and under Bush, we had immigration at a much lower rate than before. Now, some of this is not due to any US policy. Mexico has become, on balance, more stable and has aged, and so there's less migration from there. But the fact remains that people who hype up immigration as a threat to US workers or a threat to the US economy are pointing at something that has gone into retreat. And moreover, again, in comparison to the other major democracies, the US, which is supposed to be the open immigration country, and I hope will be again, has been doing less. All of these charts are comparable scale except Italy in the lower right, because Italy took in this enormous refugee and migrant load in the early 2000s. But everyone else, you can see the US since 95, we've been having a decline in the annual growth rate of immigration. Whereas, again, even Japan, France, they've all gone up. Other countries that have fluctuated, they're fluctuating at higher levels, like the UK or Australia, than the US. So the story that we're just exposed to immigrants, whatever the theatrics on the border, is a false one as well. So what about this manufacturing obsession? I noted that Joe Biden, President Biden, when announcing the America Jobs Program, kept invoking the idea of these good jobs, these blue-collar good jobs. And for more than 50 years, politicians of both parties have been claiming that unfair trade is the source of manufacturing decline in the US. Essentially, you started with Germany and Japan, then you talked about Mexico and South Korea, and now you talk about China. I'm not giving these countries a pass. There were policies they did to take advantage of it. But there's something weird that each decade it's somebody new and nobody else is having this problem. That is not a credible statement. This is this notion that there was an economic stabbing in the back by neoliberals. But, and again, Robert and many others are not many. This is about we're designing policies that at most will benefit a small fraction of the American workforce and charging the rest of the workforce for those policies. Doing dangerous things to produce heavy objects is just sort of resonant with nostalgic Americans in a way that women and people of color providing human services does not. Workers in today's America, which includes white males. People soldering cars, men in big helmets. And this is a gendered statement. If you obsess on manufacturing, you're obsessing on white males. And this is the key point. Robert Lawrence and his co-author, Lawrence Edwards, in a book done by the Institute in 2013, started to point this out, and we, Madi and others, and Ava have updated the data with Simeon. And what you see is that almost every country has seen essentially the same slope of decline in manufacturing employment steadily. There's no spike and acceleration in the decline when China enters the WTO in 2000. There's no lack of decline for Germany or Korea or Japan that are busy doing supposedly all this unfair trade. Yes, they have higher levels of manufacturing employment than the US does, but top level now is below 20%. The US is currently at 10%. So what are you going to do? Are you going to somehow reverse this entire trend that no one else has had and any success doing? Are you going to do more than create 1 or 2% new jobs in manufacturing? That's a very uphill battle. Let me also point out that while we're doing this, the US has been, in its protectionism, has not been doing much to involve its workers. Our colleague Jacob Kierkegaard has written about this in the past in Europe. I pointed out about Abenomics and womenomics in Japan. But except for Italy, basically the US has been doing a terrible job on involving women's labor force participation. Penny, Simeon, Ava have done some great work on this, and particularly during the COVID crisis, this has worsened. But the point for this argument is that all this protectionism that the US has engaged in, all this blocking of immigration or reduction of immigration, all this blocking of corporate takeovers from abroad has resulted in a labor market that is less functional and less productive for average people in terms of opportunities. And there are many reasons why women may not be in the labor force even pre-COVID, and it may not be reasonable to say that they have to be at exactly 50-50. There are demographics, there are social issues. But when Japan, Germany, Canada, France, UK have all raised their female labor force participation up by several percentage points above that in the US, it's telling us the current approach is failing. I also want to say that unfortunately, sadly, we have no reliable solutions for dealing with local communities in economic decline. We're all familiar with the great journalism talking about this. Many smart people, our former colleague Simeon Johnson and Jonathan Gruber had a book about trying to revitalize small cities in the US by investing in colleges. There are many things out there, well-intentioned and an understandable reaction to compassionate problems. But the fact is, for every Pittsburgh or Detroit, which we've seen have a partial revival, there are several dozen Lawrences and Lowells which have never come back. I grew up in Massachusetts. People were moaning the collapse of Lawrence and Lowell mills from 50 years before throughout my childhood, and they're still not back. It's more than that. When we look at German reunification, when we look at Southern Italy, when we look at rural Japan, even Western China, we've seen countries and economies where they transfer vast sums, several percent of GDP a year, to these regions on a sustained basis for decades. And there's no income convergence, and there's little convergence in comparative unemployment rates. In the end, no one should be abandoned simply because of where they live, and no community deserves to decline. But governments should not be making unfulfillable promises to their citizens either. In the end, again, we've omitted a large part of the story. African Americans and Latinx workers in the US have moved about the country in mass in various times to find opportunity. Immigrant parents of today's, or grandparents of today's rural whites have done the same. So we can't fixate on this norm that everyone has to stay where they are and we need to support them where they are. In fact, this is going to become even more of a tension as climate change and public health needs make it more important that people are mobile and that people do not end up in isolated places. What we do have reliable solutions for is helping workers and families instead of jobs and places. So instead of the US economic policy being too liberal, neoliberal on trade, what we've been is way too neoliberal on domestic issues. There are things we can do that every other wealthy democracy does and we currently do not do. We can make it easier for people to access and move to jobs from away from their current location. We can subsidize transportation. We can improve childcare availability. We can provide affordable housing near where there are jobs, taking on zoning. We could invest 10 times what we do now in active labor market policies like Denmark and now many other Western European economies do, spending 1% to 2% of GDP instead of 0.1% of GDP. Right now, it's only trade-affected workers who get large targeted adjustment, as colleagues at the AEI recently pointed out. And that hasn't worked. It hasn't provided the jobs, it hasn't provided the adjustment, and it hasn't bought off the anger. So we need a more ambitious social welfare that is oriented to all people. Most of all, we can make work-related benefits universal and portable rather than job-specific. And if we do that, we have to get past the neoliberal mindset of exaggerating the supply disincentives when we give people benefits. And I'm hopeful that what's happening now with the pandemic will help break that mindset. And finally, I would say this is entirely affordable if we pay for it, and we can. Our tax rates remain incredibly low on higher income individuals and on corporations, and we do not enforce those tax collection and we do not enforce regulations. There is more we can do. We do not have to be in this situation. We can help workers and families. I also want to emphasize that it's not just a negative. I think that re-globalizing the US in addition to these domestic policies would help raise workers up. Just as the statement where we keep sadly saying this is not who we are in the face of racist violence, and that lets the US off too easily. When we talk about the US as the most open, the most competitive, the most opportunity-rich economy, this is self-delusion. There's a lot of work, Thomas Piketty, Jason Furman, many others, looking at Luigi Zingales, looking at the breakdown in competition in the US and the lack of opportunity, the data insights group, Raj Chetty and Jonathan Friedman, the US is kidding itself. And so unilateral efforts and nostalgia to restore the US of old was just going to become ever more futile because the US is smaller. As Penny will discuss, trade is going on even if the US pulls itself out. Investment is going on even if the US pulls itself out. And we're already being unjust to the vast majority of lower income workers by focusing this way. So instead, the US should be entering into international agreements to open itself up again and should be raising its own standards. We should be engaging, and I praise Secretary Yellen for taking this on, international corporate taxation, minimum corporate taxes against digital shifting of profits. We should have a carbon price, not just subsidizing more heavy industry. We should be meeting the international labor standards, worker rights, including organization. I used to fear that the AFL would never approve a trade deal. They were using labor standards as an excuse. The revision of USMCA, for all its failures, actually includes labor standards, and labor didn't block it. I think that shows us the direction to go. And if we, the US, joins with Europe, with other countries with higher standards, that will raise us up. And finally, we should support our allies engaging what I've written about elsewhere, what I call principled plurilateralism, as exemplified by CPTPP or the EU-Japan deal. If the US is unready to do trade, let's encourage others to keep doing high standard agreements that are opening and then put the pressure on us ourselves. So I'd ask you all to take a look at my new article in Foreign Affairs, The Price of Nostalgia. I'd ask you to take a look, importantly, at the data that Simeon, Madi, Ava, and her colleagues have put together on the PIA website. I ask you to listen to Robert and Penny, who have slightly different views than mine. We each have our own views, but I think flesh out this picture of the US in a broader global context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Just to remind our participants that you can send us questions through the Q&A function. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So in my analysis, I'm actually going to focus on one particular dimension of the performance of US manufacturing that Adam emphasized, and that is what's been happening to the share of employment in manufacturing. As Adam pointed out, this is a phenomenon that has been going on for a very, very long time, going back to the 1960s, long before globalization of the US economy was a major feature. However, starting around 2000, there was a precipitous decline. So it wasn't just the share of manufacturing employment that fell, but it was also the absolute number. The US lost something like 5.8 million jobs between 2000 and 2010. And since then, while there has been some recovery, it's only retrieved something like 15 or 20% of the jobs that were lost in the prior decade. It's also important to emphasize, though, as I just did, that there has been this long-run decline. And I would also add to what Adam has said, although I won't be featuring it in this presentation, there's been a dramatic change in the composition of the way we produce products that has been tremendously skill biased. So what you see is that the new forms of manufacturing are far more skill intensive. In other words, providing fewer jobs proportionately for those workers who don't have a college degree. It's much more capital intensive. And within the capital intensity, it's much more intensive in intellectual property products. So that we have the emergence of a manufacturing sector, which is far more limited in its capacity to provide the escalator into the middle class that yesterday's manufacturing sector was able to do. Now, if we listen to the common debate about why these trends and what caused particularly that precipitous decline after 2000, to oversimplify only slightly, the debate is often couched in terms of was it globalization, was it foreigners, or is it technological change? Many economists point to the relatively rapid productivity growth that has occurred in manufacturing as the explanation. Others say trade has played a significant role, especially after 2000, in that precipitous decline. And there have been very influential papers which have looked at China's, what's called the China shock, the emergence of China, and its impact on regional US economy. So basically, was it that the robots are taking the jobs, or is it that the Chinese are taking the jobs? Well, what has really struck me about the entire debate is that almost totally absent is a consideration of the role of demand, both in the long run, in the declining share of manufacturing employment, and particularly in the role of slow growth. After all, the decade of the 2000s was a decade in which the United States experienced extremely slow economic growth. In addition, what we see is that as people become richer, and what I show you here is a division by quintiles in percentage that people spend on goods. And you'll notice two very interesting features. The first is that at all income levels, people are allocating less and less of their expenditure to goods. And you also notice that as people become richer, they spend even smaller and smaller shares of their expenditures on goods. Rich people buy more and more services. So we need to take the role of demand into consideration. And then there's the fact that, firstly, the demand for manufacturing goods is very cyclical. You can delay your purchase of an automobile for another year or two. Durables, in particular, fluctuate in a very volatile way over the business cycle. And what we had in the period between 2000 and 2010 was A, extraordinarily slow economic growth. You can see here in the chart, the average growth rate of the US economy was 1.9%. That was virtually half of the growth rates of the prior 3 decades, and even slower relative to what was achieved in the 1960s. And the second feature, of course, is 2 large recessions: the bursting of the dot-com bubble after 2000 and the Great Recession associated with the financial crisis thereafter. So it is very surprising that no one has integrated this feature of the US economy into the explanation for that absolute loss of jobs. And that's what I want to take you through very briefly. There is, if you ask the economists who use the official data for manufacturing, a very powerful explanation that rests on relatively more rapid productivity growth in manufacturing. But there's a problem with that explanation, and I'll elaborate upon that in a moment. It turns out that that explanation rests very heavily on the performance of just one American industry, computer and electronics. If you take that industry out of the data, and you use non-computer manufacturing, what you find is that productivity growth hasn't been all that more rapid in the residual part of the manufacturing sector as compared to the rest of the economy. And the result of doing this is that you get an explanation in which productivity growth plays some role, but demand, both its cyclical nature and the long run decline in the expenditure shares that people devote to goods, plays a much, much larger role. The problem with using the manufacturing aggregate is that it's so heavily driven by our measurement of computer productivity that it is, in a sense, the tail that wags the entire dog. Yet we know that only about 12% of the job loss in the US economy came in the manufacturing sector. So it makes more sense to get below the surface and to take out the manufacturing, the role of manufacturing. So let me just illustrate, firstly, that if you treat manufacturing as an aggregate, you can take the definition of the change in the labor share, and it is by definition equal to the change in output, the difference between the output of manufacturing and the output of GDP, and the difference in labor productivity growth. And if you look at what happened over this particular decade, between 2000 and 2010, you can see there was a 3.9% decline in the manufacturing share. You can see that there wasn't a very big difference in the behavior of the official data for the quantity of manufacturing output versus GDP. It boils down to only 0.3%. And the big story is the productivity story. There's a 3.6% difference in the productivity growth in manufacturing as compared to the rest of the economy. So if you look at most of the economic work on why the erosion of manufacturing employment, you'll see the big story is focusing on productivity growth And there isn't a very big story for output growth. If you thought trade was a very important factor in the loss of manufacturing jobs, you would expect to see trade, you would expect to see output playing a much bigger role. After all, if you get increased competition from foreigners, you produce less at home. So what happens if we take out the manufacturing sector? Well, then it turns out we get a decline in the share, which is quite similar. This is an annual share decline of about 3.7%. However, now we see that output is a much bigger part of the story, accounting for 2.3 percentage points of the decline, and the differences in productivity just 1.4. So without the computer industry, we see a much bigger role for output. Some analysts have looked at this and said, aha, it must be trade. But the problem is that both international trade competition, causing a loss of manufacturing jobs, and a decline in demand will have similar effects in depressing output. So it's necessary to do some more work and ask the question, given the growth rates in the US economy, what would we have expected would happen to output? And so I've been doing some econometric work on this. And what I find is that indeed, manufacturing growth, output growth, is very, very cyclically sensitive. Indeed, if you look at this equation on the left, there's a lot of numbers here. But basically, if you had no growth in GDP, manufacturing output would fall by 3.3% a year. So it takes at least 2% growth rate in GDP for manufacturing output not to fall. And if we use this equation and we fit it up until 2000, in other words, we capture the historical relationship between GDP, the relative price of manufactured goods, and non-computer output, and we use it to predict it out of sample, what we find is that that equation predicts almost exactly what happened, which is that manufacturing output fell at about 0.3% a year. So the explanation for that declining output does not appear to be international trade. It can be almost fully explained by the fact that this was a decade of very slow economic growth and two big recessions, and output of manufacturing and the demand for those products is very sensitive to cyclical fluctuations. If we try to look at the longer run, what we see is that the demand income elasticity, for every 1% increase in income, there's only about 0.4% increase in the demand for manufacturing output. So just as we know, when people get richer, they allocate fewer and fewer of their purchases to food, in a very similar way, we can see that over the long run, the demand for manufactured output has been declining over time. The result is that there are two contrasting views that are captured. The first is when we take manufacturing as a whole, and that leads to rather optimistic conclusions, because the orange line shows that the quantity of total manufacturing output and GDP have basically remained pretty constant, in fact, going back to the 1950s. And this is a view actually Adam even referred to earlier in his presentation. And if you ask, though, what's happened to the share of nominal spending, there what you see is that the share that people are devoting to manufacturing has been falling. And why has it been falling? Well, in this view, it's been falling because manufactured goods have been getting cheaper because of faster productivity growth. So this, in a sense, is the productivity view, and it reflects the fact that manufacturing is being treated as an aggregate, but it's being very heavily influenced by the role and deflation processes that are used in the computer industry. By contrast, if you drop computers from your analysis, what you see there is, roughly speaking, the relative prices of these products haven't fallen very much. And what explains the declining nominal shares are the declining quantities. And this, therefore, is a reflection of this long-run inelastic demand for non-computer manufactured products. So let me conclude that there are these two perspectives, and it's important to be alert to people who are using them. Those who are simply treating manufacturing as an aggregate are coming up with a productivity story. In a sense, it's all about automation. But there are questions when it comes to that story, because manufacturing, the computer industry, is playing a disproportionate role. By contrast, if you take a more realistic view and you subtract out the computers or industry, or you allow it to play a much lower role, and look at what's happened in the rest of manufacturing, you see a combination of some productivity growth, but also income elasticities. The bottom line, though, is that these two facets, income and technological change, do an extraordinarily good job of explaining what happened to manufacturing jobs in the United States, not only the long run, but also in that decade between 2000 and 2010, when the 5.8 million jobs were lost. And so while we've seen a lot of microeconomic studies which have brought out the fact that trade has disrupted local communities, those same studies actually suggest that in the aggregate, when you take account of the fact that there were other communities that were positively affected by export growth, there isn't a very large residual that is left to be explained by international trade. It's much more those fundamental factors that have persisted for a very long time, relatively rapid productivity growth, and what I would add, long-run trends in the demand for goods. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Robert. Please keep sending us your questions through the Q&A function. We already have a number of very interesting questions. Penny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simeon. So Adam and Robert already covered plenty of ground. So I'm not going to talk about the US and how US jobs are affected by trade. Instead, I'm going to look at these issues from a different angle, from the point of view of what's been happening globally, of what the global trade patterns have been. And then at the end, I'm going to come back to the question of how we are to evaluate US policy in the context of these global trends. So to give you the preview, I want to make two main points. The first one is that most of us think of the last decade as being a decade of deglobalization or slowbalization. And these terms apply not only to the US, but people apply them to the global environment. I will argue where there has been a slowdown in trade, there is no evidence to date to suggest that trade has run its course and that technology has replaced the importance of trade. Second, I want to focus on some more recent trends that have emerged in response to the US-China trade tensions. And I will argue that what we see is not the end of trade, not the death of trade, but we see trade re-emerging in a different form, focused more on regional trade agreements and with the center of economic activity gravitating more towards East Asia. So my conclusion is going to be that given these trends, there is a real danger for the US to miss out on the future if it focuses on the domestic economy exclusively and tries to completely withdraw from trade. So let me start with the first point, and I have a few slides just to reinforce my messages. So let me share the screen with you. The 90s are often, the 90s are often characterized as the age of hyperglobalization, and globalization in the 90s was fueled by global value chains. So this is a graph that comes out of the work I did at the World Bank in the context of the World Development Report. And you can see the trade through global value chains exploding in the 80s and the 90s. Then comes the financial crisis in 2000, 2009, and trade collapses during that time. After that, it starts rising again, but it never gains, global value chains never gain their former momentum. So this is one of the reasons, not the only one, that people started talking around this time about deglobalization or slowbalization, if you want. And there has been a very large literature exploring different reasons for these trends. Let me mention the two main explanations because they do have implications for US policy. The first implication that I think is reflected in the data is that it has a lot to do with China. So China, during that period, starts rebalancing its economy, focusing more on the domestic economy. And you see that in the increase in the domestic value in China. Now, China is a very large economy, so when China changes its policy, this is affected, this is reflected in the aggregate statistics. However, beyond China, I would say this is not a global trend. So you don't see an increase in domestic value added globally. And you can see that in that graph, you see this reversal in trend that I just mentioned in China. So domestic value increases in China. The same happens in Korea. But if you look at other major economies across the world, so Germany, Japan, the United States, domestic value remains fairly constant. Another explanation that has been suggested that I think that's much more important and worth thinking about is that international fragmentation ran its course. And the idea there is that part of the reason we saw more trade in the previous decades is because it became possible, because of technology, to take a product, split it into many parts, and start trading the parts and components. Eventually, you run out of ways to chop up this product. And therefore, fragmentation eventually would come to an end, and with that also the scope of further increase in trade. Even though this explanation is plausible, I've never been convinced by it, and this graph can give you an idea why. This graph shows trade in intermediate products and also trade in parts and components. And we can take these trends as a measure of how important fragmentation is, international fragmentation is over time. So again, you see this decline in trade that I mentioned before during the financial crisis. After that, you see a rise. And then this is trade in intermediate products. And then the reason people start talking about deglobalization again is starting with the year 2014. So on the right panel, you can see everything magnified. You can see everything more clearly. Around 2014, you see growth declining, growth in intermediates. Now, the problem with that is intermediates, export in intermediates are very much affected by commodity prices. So a better measure is to look at trade in parts and components, so which is expressed in volume. So that gives you a better idea of how much scope there is for fragmentation. And if you look at the red line in the graph, you'll see that in 2016, trade in parts and components starts increasing again. So this would argue against this view that fragmentation has run its course. There is an additional explanation that people emphasize, and both Adam and Robert hinted at that, namely that with increasing automation, with robots taking over, there will be a tendency for countries, for firms to reshore economic activities, and therefore there will be less trade. Another way to put it is that there is less incentive for firms to outsource activities to low-wage countries. They can substitute low-wage workers in other countries by machines at home. Again, this may seem intuitive, but if you actually look at the empirical evidence, so far there has been little support for these claims to date. And here I'm thinking of work that was done by Caroline Freund, among others, and who used to be at Peterson, and Michele Ruta, that showed that if you look at 3D printing, for example, automation and robots increase trade. And the reason for that is there was a scale effect. So robots increased productivity. Therefore, they allowed firms to increase the scale of production. And as production increased, firms also imported more intermediates from other countries. So as a result, robots and automation led to an increase in trade in intermediates, not a decrease in trade. So the point is that all these trends suggest that there may have been a slowdown in trade, partly because we saw China rebalancing its economy, but there is no evidence that we have a secular decline of international fragmentation. What has happened, however, in the last decade is policy has changed. The rhetoric around trade and globalization have changed. We saw an enormous backlash against globalization that I would claim was not unique to the United States. It was shared by Britain, for example. We saw Brexit. We saw the America First movement. We saw the US-China trade war. So there has been this backlash against globalization, and perhaps the words have been more important than actual policy to date, although Brexit was a major move. But words matter in policy and they matter in trade. At the minimum, they affect investment, and we know that foreign direct investment is complement with trade. So this change in rhetoric has had effects, especially in Great Britain, but also in the United States, as Adam documented earlier on. The second point I want to make is coming now to the recent trade war between US and China. The effects on US consumers and US firms have been documented by myself and co-authors, among others. But in the international community, there has been increasing anxiety about how the trade war, how these increasing tensions between US and China are going to affect other countries. And so in some recent work that I did with some co-authors, including Pablo Fagelbaum, Amit Khandelwal, and Pat Kennedy, so the same co-authors with whom we had worked on the effects on US, what we found is that as a result of the US-China trade war, there was a reallocation of global trade flows. And this graph can give you some sense of what happened. So what we document is that many countries, in fact, most countries, increased their exports to the United States and China. This is not surprising. This is what you would expect to happen. But perhaps surprisingly, at the same time, they increased their exports to the rest of the world. Take, for example, Vietnam, a country that has been featured very prominently in the public debate. So Vietnam increased its sales, its exports to the United States and also to China. But at the same time, it increased its sales, its exports to every other country in the world. So as a result, the total exports of Vietnam to the rest of the world increased. So what you see in this graph is we have sorted countries according to the change in export value, and the methodology here is such that we isolate the effect of the tariffs. So we net out all other things that have been happening at the same time. So we sorted the countries in terms of increasing response, and the red dot represents the increase in total demand, in worldwide demand. The green dot represents the change in exports to US and China, and the blue is to the rest of the world. So if you focus on the red dot, so this is total worldwide exports, what you see is that most countries are above zero. So most countries experience an increase in their exports, their total exports, as a result of the US-China trade tensions. And this increase is most pronounced in the case of Vietnam, as I mentioned, but there are many other countries that exhibit the same pattern. So including many countries in East Asia, including Singapore, Thailand, Myanmar, but there are also countries in Europe and also other countries in Central Asia. Interestingly, the countries that fare worst are countries in Latin America, including Colombia, Brazil, Argentina. And it's a very interesting question of why do we see this differential response across countries. To make a long story short, what we find in the paper, it's not just because of pre-existing export baskets, it's also the fact that some countries were better positioned to take advantage of these trends. So this is one finding. A second finding, I think, is even more interesting and important in the context of what we are discussing today. Namely, at the same time, we find that the prices that these countries charge to the rest of the world also go down. And so these dots here represent prices to different destinations. And what I want you to take away from this graph is that most of these price changes are below zero, right? So we have a decline in prices. In this next graph, we relate the price declines to quantity increases. So most of the observations, most of the country observations are in this part of the graph, suggesting that those countries which increase their exports the most are also the countries that reduce their prices, their export prices to the rest of the world. Now, why is this significant? So we know from introductory economics that when we see quantity go up and at the same time price goes down, this suggests a supply response, not just a demand response. So most of us would have thought that when countries respond to the US-China trade tensions, they're faced with a demand shock and an increase in their demand because of what's happening in the US or China. But when you see the prices going down, that suggests that there is also a supply response. And in this context, the plausible supply response is that these countries are investing in capacity, in additional capacity, in order to expand their export sales to the rest of the world. For Vietnam, for example, it's been documented that global value chains are moving away from China towards Vietnam. So, but the same pattern applies not only to Vietnam, to many other countries. So what this suggests again is that we see a response worldwide that rather than shying away from trade is trying to take advantage of the tensions between the US and China in order to increase trade with other countries. So this is what the trade flows look like. There is additional evidence that comes from other sources. There has been an increase, I won't say an increase, but there has been a reinvigoration of trade agreements that are regional or plurilateral in nature. And of course, RCEP comes to mind, and also more recently, the comprehensive agreement on investment between Europe and China. So these are agreements that, if you take RCEP, it covers about 30% of the world's population, about 30% of global GDP. Even if it's often portrayed as being shallow, it does cover a very large share of the world economy. The investment agreement between Europe and China touches on some extremely important issues that have been contentious between US and China. Adam already mentioned CPTPP, that's happening without the participation of the United States. What's notable about all these agreements is that East Asian economies have definitely a presence in these agreements. In many of them, China also has a very strong presence. So while China is advertising the rebalancing of its economy and a dual circulation model, where it's focusing more on its domestic economy rather than trade. At the very same time, we see China being very proactive in the international arena. So all this suggests, as I summarized at the beginning, that the world is not moving away from trade. Trade is perhaps taking a new form. It's focused more on regions or on plurilateral agreements rather than on global agreements. But we see many countries being very active in this domain. And against this background, the real risk for the United States is that it misses out on what's happening in the rest of the world. We saw that a little bit playing out in the context of the CPTPP. But going forward, the implications could be even more important. And finally, let me very briefly close with a reference to what's been happening as a result of COVID. COVID-19 has, of course, muddled all long-term trends. But one notable fact that has emerged during this period is that we saw some form of trade, namely trade in data-intensive services, go up. So during the pandemic, all of us relied more than ever on e-commerce, on digital trade on some particular type of services. So services could be the new frontier for trade. They raise a bunch of extremely difficult issues of regulatory coordination between countries. And it's more important than ever to discuss these issues globally and find multilateral solutions. So again, by stepping away from this agenda, by focusing exclusively on the domestic economy and on manufacturing jobs, as Adam and Robert put it, there is a real risk for the US economy that it misses out on the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Penny, and all speakers. I'll immediately move to questions. There are many questions on our Q&A. Adam will field the first question, which is on nostalgia. So Adam, you spoke about nostalgia, obsession with good manufacturing jobs in many countries, but particularly in the US. Could you elaborate why the US and why is it also spread across the political spectrum? Please, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it was Sean who raised that. Look, there are things that are not economics. The US, for historical reasons, is a divided society. And we are, as the Alicina and Sacerdote, and I'm forgetting somebody, work did on looking at why there was no welfare state in the US, racial political divisions did a lot to prevent us from having that. And I think that same thing is true here. That there are fundamental long-standing political divides in this country where reactionary people sympathetic to the privileged status of white males are now associating that with trade and globalization and change. And that is somewhat a universal thing. We see that in France, we see that in Germany, we see that in other places. But the extent of it and the depth of it is not unique to the US, but is especially true in the US. And that's part of the point of the argument I'm trying to make, is that this isn't economics. This isn't just that you can buy these people off, the so-called losers from trade, and compensate them. They're more concerned with relative status. They're more concerned with other people who don't look like them freeloading. They're more concerned with disruption and change. And that's the other piece of it. And this goes back to work, although Danny Roderick wouldn't agree with most of what I said, this goes back to some of Danny Roderick's long ago work on openness and welfare states. The fact is that the US has spent the last 70 years basically running around saying everybody else is less open than us. Everybody else has to live up to our standards. And that legacy is blinding people in the US, that it's the US now that has to subject itself to some amount of international constraint and standards in order to move ahead. And so this is really about mental frames, I think. And so why is it both left and right? I think it's a combination of political opportunism on both sides, as well as some sincere people saying, look, there's pain. There are these cities and towns filled with people who are suffering. There is the stuff referred to in the China shock, which, you know, is really bad for those people and really bad for those communities. But this ignores just how much of that kind of turbulence in location, in surroundings, in employment is normal for people of color and for women in lower income jobs in this country. And so we have to start being more realistic and more universal in our approach.
Thank you very much. Adam, the next question or set of questions, putting questions together, is for Penny on the China shock. Penny, you mentioned about that. You also mentioned Vietnam and other countries coming up. So is the China shock over, or we are continuing to see this type of effects in trade, either in goods or services? And then the studies that have specifically mentioned the China shock, like the Autor and et al. Study, are we refuting it now? Are we adding new evidence to it? Penny.
Yes, thank you, Simeon. Thank you for asking this question. So first of all, I think I deserve this question because I was editor at the AR when the paper was published, and I was the editor who handled it. So just, to answer the question in a very direct way, I would not have accepted the paper if I didn't believe the results. I believe the results in Autor and all, but the question is what the results say and what they don't say. And what I think they do show quite convincingly is that China's entry into the world markets caused disruption. I don't think we can deny that. And this disruption happened at the community level, actually at the commuting zone level in the United States. This is also what Adam mentioned at the beginning. There is plenty of evidence that particular communities were adversely affected by imports. What it does not say is that the Chinese imports, that the China shock is responsible for the aggregate decline in manufacturing. So the kind of trends that Robert showed. And in fact, I think Robert has made this point in separate work that if you actually put the numbers down in terms of factor content of trade, there is no way you can explain the lost jobs just by the China shock. More generally, my view on that paper has been that the innovation and the value added was to focus on the local communities. That was a new angle when we think about the effects of trade. As it turns out, people have repeated this exercise looking at NAFTA or other episodes where you would expect to see the disruption at the local level. And again, you do find these effects at the local level, right? So it's not China that made the difference. It's just the fact that the effects play out at the community zone level. But it doesn't say anything about aggregate effects. Right, so that's the difference, and that raises the questions that Adam posed at the beginning of his remarks, namely, what's the best way to deal with them? Right? It's should we be protecting places, or should we try to help people move to other communities, get different jobs? I think that's the question that we are all faced with, and frankly, my opinion is we have not had satisfactory answers to date, and that's why we see also this backlash against trade from time to time. For example, trade adjustment assistance is a program that in principle is very promising, but it has always been underfunded. So there is the question, perhaps we should put more money in it, because then we might see some positive effects, but it's an unresolved question of how do we address these effects best. I'm very much with Adam that the answer is not to return to the past. Nostalgia is not the answer. As to whether the shock is over, so again, there is another paper by these authors that claim it's over by now, in the sense that the increase in imports we witnessed in the previous decade has subsided. I'm not clearly imports from China to the United States are not rising as fast, but in general, the U.S. has been closing up. So not only vis-a-vis China, but again, as Adam showed, vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Thank you, Penny. And Robert, the last set of questions for you. I'm trying to amalgamate a number of questions. This concerns TPA renewal. It seems unlikely, but there is an opportunity to reform or repurpose TAA. And I think in some of your work you have mentioned that. Could that be a way to find some solutions for the 86% that you mentioned that are outside of manufacturing, non-college educated workers, and a way to help them through the crisis and what they have been going through? And related to that, Robert, is part of the solution this portability of benefits that Adam mentioned and you have mentioned in your work? If you can combine these two, please.
Yes, so I believe that, in fact, we should not be thinking about a trade adjustment assistance program, but a broad adjustment assistance program. The dislocation of American workers due to trade has been painful, but it is only a small amount of the total dislocation that has occurred in the economy for a whole variety of reasons. And what we need, and Adam did refer to this, are much broader programs that help and facilitate adjustment. Some of these would involve, for instance, taking, and we started to work on this to a modest degree, but nowhere near as well as we could. And that is at the community level, integrating shortages for skills that firms have with workers who are looking for jobs. So we need a sophisticated way of marrying the needs of firms with workers who get trained, not necessarily in formal college degrees, but in ways they can certify they have developed competences which the firms are looking for. And some of the big information technology firms like Amazon have started programs of this nature. And that's what we need to expand upon. I actually think there's also, I've always been a proponent of real wage insurance, which Robert Lighton and I came up with in the 1980s. That is to say, a mechanism for compensating workers who lose high wage jobs. There is some component of that in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, but it could be much broader as a way to, we know that when people lose their jobs, it can cost them something like, if they do it in a large dislocation, it can cost them like times their annual income. And so there is a lot of scope to cushion that blow. And finally, I would say, we also need to think about an insurance program for community tax bases. When a local community experiences a plant closure, it's not just the fact that it loses that revenue, and the plant could close for any number of reasons. It could also be a crop failure, by the way. But it then finds itself in a downward spiral in which it can't maintain the services which it normally provides to its residents, and then it starts to lose more people. And so to cushion that blow, not permanently, because ultimately we do want adjustment to the new realities, there's a mechanism, because of the fact that the shocks don't all hit the communities together, there's an insurance system that we should be thinking about that would parallel the unemployment insurance system with tax-based insurance for communities. So I think there's much more scope to be imaginative in helping people who need to adjust to the new realities in our economy. And just finally, I would say that protection is not the answer. Because what we know is that even if we assume it was successful in closing off our economy, after that, the demand for those workers will depend on our domestic demand for the products they produce. And the evidence is that will grow more slowly than income. And so we will be back on the downward escalator. So protection may well be a temporary band-aid, but it's not a long-term solution.
Thank you very much, Robert. Adam, Penny, thank you for all of your comments and all this research. We will stop here. There are a number of other comments that we've recorded and we'll use in our further analysis. And everybody who participated in today's seminar, thank you very much for your time and interest. Bye-bye.